My name is Samuel King. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my life, I thought I was tough enough to face anything. As a firefighter, I'd run into burning buildings without hesitation, confident I could control the chaos. That was before the accident, before a collapsing beam trapped me, forcing me to watch a child die in the flames. I walked away physically unscathed, but the guilt stayed with me. Now I live off-grid in my RV, drifting from one remote spot to another, trying to outrun memories that won't let me sleep. That's how I ended up at Seneca Rocks in West Virginia, chasing a rumor about a place called Devil's Hollow. A bartender at a rundown pub had mentioned it after a few beers, describing it as the kind of place that eats your soul. It sounded melodramatic, but the idea hooked me. Maybe the isolation would help. Maybe confronting something darker than my own mind would finally give me peace. I drove into the woods early on a foggy morning, the narrow road twisting like a serpent through dense trees. My RV bounced over potholes, the forest pressing closer with every mile. The air was heavy, damp with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. It felt like the kind of place the world forgot. Eventually, the road dead-ended in a clearing. I parked, stepped outside, and stretched, scanning the area. A rough trail led deeper into the woods, marked by a weathered sign that read, "Devil's Hollow. Keep out." Perfect. The kind of ominous warning I'd come to expect from overblown local legends. I grabbed my backpack, packed with a flashlight, a knife, and some snacks, and set off down the trail. The forest grew denser with every step. The trees gnarled and twisted as if trying to block my way. The wind didn't reach this far in. It was silent, except for the crunch of my boots on the leaf-strewn path. By mid-afternoon, I reached an old campsite. A fire pit, long cold, sat surrounded by rusted cans and scraps of cloth. A torn hiking boot lay in the dirt, its laces frayed. Nearby, I found a tattered map folded against a rock. I picked it up. Furiously scrawled in the margin were 3 words, "Don't follow them." I frowned, glancing around. "Follow who?" I muttered, shoving the map into my pocket. I moved on, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees leaned closer, their bark cracked and blackened. Strange carvings appeared, faces twisted in agony, their mouths open as if screaming. By the time I set up camp, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the woods shrouded in twilight. I built a small fire and sat beside it, staring into the flames. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of crying, a woman's voice, soft and broken, coming from the trees. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife at my belt. "Hello?" I called, my voice rough in the still air. The crying stopped. I stood, shining my flashlight toward the sound. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating nothing but endless trees. "Anyone out there?" I called again, louder this time. Nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and my own breathing. I told myself it was probably an animal, some nocturnal bird, or a trick of the wind. Still, I kept the knife close as I lay down for the night. I woke sometime after midnight to the sound of footsteps outside my tent, slow, deliberate. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my flashlight and knife, crawling out of the tent as quietly as I could. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light over the campsite. That's when I saw her. A young woman stood at the edge of the clearing, barefoot and dirty, her long hair tangled with leaves. She looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "don't go deeper." "Who are you?" I asked, my throat dry. "What are you doing out here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and disappeared into the trees, her figure swallowed by the darkness. I hesitated, every instinct telling me not to follow. But something about her felt off, like she didn't belong here any more than I did. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Against my better judgment, I packed up camp and followed her trail. The carvings on the trees grew more frequent and grotesque, the air heavier with each step. I felt like I was walking into a trap, but I couldn't turn back. Not yet. That's when I found it. A natural rock arch rising out of the forest floor, its surface covered in ancient-looking symbols. Beneath it lay a shallow pit filled with ash and bones. Human bones. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. The ground felt wrong here, the air thick with something I couldn't name. As I stood there, the shadows seemed to shift, coalescing into a figure. It was massive, its body cloaked in darkness, its eyes burning red. The apparition didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and searing, as if it were peeling back my skin to look inside me. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder. I ran. The forest closed in around me, the trees twisting into impossible shapes. The path I'd followed was gone, replaced by jagged rocks and thick underbrush. The creature's voice followed me, low and mocking, whispering my failures, my guilt, my pain. "You let her die," it hissed, the words striking like a whip. "You watched her burn." I tripped, falling hard onto the ground. When I looked up, the woman was there again, different now. Her face was pale and streaked with tears, her eyes hollow. "Help me," she begged, reaching out a hand. I hesitated. The creature's voice filled my head again. "You can't save her. You couldn't save anyone." I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stand. "You're not real," I said, my voice shaking. "You're just in my head." The apparition laughed, a terrible sound that echoed through the hollow. "Everything here is real, Samuel, including your sins." I turned and ran again, ignoring the whispers, the shadows, the faces that seemed to form in the trees. When I finally stumbled back to my RV, I was bleeding and covered in scratches, but alive. The air felt lighter as I slammed the door shut and locked it. I drove out of those woods without looking back. Whatever had been in the hollow, ghost, demon, or something worse, it hadn't killed me, but it had left its mark. I still hear its voice sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, reminding me of what I've lost. I'll never go back to Devil's Hollow, and if you're smart, neither will you. My name is Amy Graham, and I'm 24 years old. This happened in late August last year during a camping trip I should have said no to. Looking back now, I wish I had trusted my instincts. But when your boyfriend insists, and his plan includes his best friend and an RV, you shrug and say, sure, why not? What could possibly go wrong? We were heading to the Glade Top Trail in Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri. It was one of those scenic, out-of-the-way places Travis found online while scouring for hidden gems. He was always chasing after some unspoiled piece of wilderness he could claim he'd conquered. He thought this trip would be perfect. A 4-day getaway with me, his best friend George, and George's sister, Hannah. I liked camping, but not like this. Not with Travis's demanding itineraries where relaxing meant hiking until your legs felt like jelly and eating instant noodles by firelight. George was just as much of a wild card. He was funny, sure, but in that irresponsible, forget everything important kind of way. And Hannah? Sweet girl, but quiet. She mostly stayed behind her camera, snapping pictures of sunsets and deer. The first day went smoothly enough. We parked the RV in a clearing off the trail, surrounded by trees turning gold and orange in the autumn chill. Travis was in his element, barking orders and setting up camp. George fumbled through his backpack, realizing he'd forgotten fuel for the portable stove. "Guess it's campfire cooking then," he joked, earning a glare from Travis. "Relax, man. It's just food." Hannah wandered off to take photos while Travis grumbled about having to adjust the meal plan. I tried to smooth things over, but I could feel the tension already brewing. That night, the forest came alive with strange sounds. The crackle of our fire barely masked the occasional rustling in the bushes or the distant hoots of owls. At one point, we heard whistling, high and sharp, like someone calling for a dog. We all froze. "Probably the wind," Travis said, poking the fire. George smirked. "Or a ghost? Isn't this place supposed to be haunted?" "Stop it," I snapped, but even I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine. The second day started with an ambitious hike. Travis insisted we take a trail that wasn't marked on the map, claiming it would lead to a hidden overlook. The trail was narrow and rocky, winding through dense trees that seemed to close in on us the further we went. Hannah stopped often to take pictures, capturing the way the light filtered through the leaves. She lingered behind, so I stayed with her while Travis and George forged ahead. I didn't mind the slower pace. Something about the forest felt off. The trees were too still, the silence too heavy. No birds chirped, no squirrels darted across the path, just the crunch of our boots and the occasional click of Hannah's camera. By the time we caught up with the others, they were standing at the edge of a clearing, staring at something. A deer stood frozen in the middle of the trail, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It didn't move, even when we got closer. "That's weird," Hannah murmured, snapping a photo. "We should keep going," Travis said, his voice tight. The deer watched us as we passed, its dark eyes following our every step. That night, the unease deepened. While sitting around the campfire, a stranger appeared on the trail. He was an older man wearing a tattered coat and carrying a walking stick. He stopped just at the edge of the firelight, his face shadowed. "Evening," he said, his voice raspy. "You folks camping out here?" Travis nodded. "Yeah, why?" The man smiled faintly. "Just be careful. Some places in these woods don't take kindly to visitors." Before any of us could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. George laughed nervously. "Well, that wasn't creepy at all." Travis brushed it off, but Hannah and I exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the man's words lingered in my mind. The third night was the worst. It started with voices, soft and indistinct, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I woke up in the RV thinking it was one of the guys, but when I looked out the window, I saw a figure standing by the dying campfire. "Travis," I whispered, but he was asleep beside me. The figure turned its head toward the RV, and in the dim light I thought I saw George's face, but something was wrong. The way he moved, jerky and unnatural, made my skin crawl. I shook Travis awake. "There's someone out there." He groaned and got up, peering out the window. By then, the figure was gone. "You're imagining things," he said, climbing back into bed. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, Hannah showed us the photos she'd taken. One of them made my blood run cold. It was a shot of the clearing, but in the background, just beyond the trees, was a tall, distorted figure. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. "Did you see this when you took it?" I asked, my voice shaking. Hannah shook her head. "No, I swear it wasn't there." Travis dismissed it as a trick of the light, but I could see the fear in his eyes. George, of course, made a joke about Bigfoot, but even he seemed unsettled. By the time night fell, we were all on edge. The forest felt alive, pressing in on us with an almost tangible weight. The whispers returned, louder this time. And they weren't just random sounds, they were calling our names. "Amy," a voice hissed, soft and familiar. I froze, gripping the edge of my seat. "Did you hear that?" George nodded, his face pale. "It said my name too." Travis grabbed the hatchet we'd been using to chop firewood. "Stay here," he ordered, stepping outside. "Don't!" I begged, but he didn't listen. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then we heard it. A blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. Travis didn't come back. We locked the RV and huddled together, waiting for dawn. The thing outside clawed at the windows, whispering in Travis's voice, begging us to let it in. It wasn't until the first light of morning that the noises stopped. Hannah and I wanted to leave immediately, but the RV wouldn't start. George went outside to check the engine and didn't come back. When we finally worked up the courage to look for him, all we found was his jacket, shredded and stained with blood. Hannah and I fled on foot, following the trail back to the main road. We didn't stop until we reached a ranger station hours later. When we tried to explain what had happened, the ranger just shook his head. "People go missing out there all the time," he said. "Best to stay away." As we drove home, I spotted a figure standing by the roadside. It looked like George, but his face was blank, expressionless. He raised a hand in a slow wave as we passed. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't think I ever will. Some places aren't meant for people. Some places belong to something else entirely. My name is Ryan Harris, and back in 1994, I decided to take a long-awaited solo camping trip in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. I had been working as a mechanic for more years than I cared to count, and I figured I had earned a week or so out in nature, away from clients who never seemed to appreciate the difference between a flat tire and a blown transmission. I set out in my old RV, not one of those shiny new ones you see advertised. This thing had quirks, but it ran. Besides, I liked the old girl. She'd kept me on the road long enough that I trusted her. The campsite was isolated enough to give me the peace I was craving. It sat near an old, unused fire tower on the edge of a lake, one of those lakes where fog settled low and gave everything an eerie look in the early morning. Not that I minded. I was all set to sit by the lake, maybe fish a little and crack open a few beers. I thought I'd get some good rest too. But it was that first night that things got weird. I hadn't been asleep for long when I heard something outside, a rustling, like someone or something rummaging around. I figured it was an animal, maybe a raccoon, but when I went to check, there was no sign of anything. Just silence, and that fog now hanging thick around the trees like a heavy cloak. I shrugged it off and went back to bed, but I was uneasy. It felt like the night itself was watching me. The second night, I decided to keep my flashlight and a heavy wrench beside my bed, just in case. I wasn't about to let some woodland critter spoil my sleep twice in a row. This time, when the rustling started, it sounded closer, like it was right by the RV door. I waited, hoping it would go away, but it didn't. Mustering up the nerve, I cracked open the door quietly and shined the flashlight into the dark. There, just outside the RV, stood a man, tall, ragged-looking, and not exactly giving off friendly vibes. His clothes were grimy and torn, like he'd been living out there for weeks, and he was holding what looked like an old hunting knife, the blade chipped and worn. He noticed the light, locked eyes with me, and grinned, an expression that made me instantly regret opening the door. I yelled out, asking what he thought he was doing here, but he didn't answer. He just kept grinning, a twisted amusement dancing on his face. I thought about grabbing the wrench, but before I could, he darted into the trees, vanishing like some kind of ghost. I spent the rest of the night locked in the RV, every sound amplified, every creak making my heart race. Morning came, and I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, maybe too many beers or a bad dream. I nearly packed up right then, but stubbornness got the better of me. I had come here to relax, and I wasn't going to let some crazy man ruin it. Besides, there was no one else around to report it to, and I didn't exactly feel like driving into town looking paranoid. The next night, though, made me wish I'd left. I had just settled in with a book when I heard the sound of metal scraping against the RV. My first thought was, not again. But this time it was different. It wasn't a curious raccoon or even the silent man from before. This was something deliberate, slow, menacing, like whoever was out there wanted me to hear them. I jumped up, wrench in hand, and opened the door a crack. The man was back, but this time he wasn't alone. Two others stood with him, both looking just as filthy and just as eager to be there. One was shorter and stocky with a crazed look in his eye, while the other seemed older, wiry, with a scar running across his face. They were holding tools, a hammer, a crowbar, and that chipped hunting knife. They watched me for a moment. Then the one with the scar started laughing, a slow, raspy sound that chilled me to the bone. He didn't say anything, just laughed as if my horror was exactly what they'd come for. Then they moved forward, surrounding the RV like a pack of wolves. I slammed the door shut, locking it, though I knew that wouldn't do much against a hammer and crowbar. My mind raced. There was no way out without facing them, and even if I could reach the driver's seat, starting the RV wasn't a quick process. My only option was to hide and hope they'd give up. The scraping grew louder, mixed with bangs and occasional laughter. They were taunting me, letting me know they weren't in a hurry. I held my breath, feeling like prey waiting for the inevitable. Then I heard glass shatter. One of them had broken a side window, and I knew they'd be inside any second. I braced myself, heart pounding, as I heard footsteps inside the RV. One of them called out mockingly, saying he just wanted to chat, his voice dripping with malice. I couldn't stay hidden. I had to do something. Creeping out from my spot, wrench in hand, I caught sight of the scarred man near the front of the RV. I swung, hitting him hard across the shoulder. He staggered back, more surprised than hurt, but it gave me a split second to bolt for the door. The stocky one lunged at me, swinging his hammer and grazing my arm, but I kept moving, scrambling out of the RV and into the trees. I could hear them behind me, laughing and taunting, making a game out of it. I had no choice but to run, heart pounding, branches slapping against my face as I pushed deeper into the woods. I lost track of time, my only goal to put as much distance as possible between them and me. Finally, I stumbled onto an old trail, barely visible in the moonlight, and followed it, hoping it led somewhere, anywhere but here. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a dim light in the distance. An old ranger station, abandoned but still standing. I rushed inside, barricading the door with whatever I could find. I didn't think it would stop them for long, but it was better than nothing. My breathing slowed, and I tried to gather my thoughts, but the quiet was short-lived. I heard footsteps outside, crunching leaves, followed by that same mocking laugh. They had followed me, and they were close. I searched the station, looking for anything to defend myself. Then I found an old flare gun. It wasn't much, but it was something. I loaded it, took a deep breath, and waited, listening to them get closer, the taunts growing louder. They were savoring every moment. The door creaked as one of them pushed against it, testing its strength. I aimed the flare gun, hand shaking, praying it would hold them off. The door burst open, and I fired. The flare shot out, hitting the scarred man in the chest. He screamed, stumbling back as flames caught his clothes. The others backed off, momentarily stunned, giving me a chance to make a run for it again. I bolted out, not looking back as his screams echoed through the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, where a passing truck finally picked me up. I was bruised, bloodied, but alive. Later, I learned from authorities that they were part of a group of deranged vagrants rumored to haunt the forest edges, targeting lone campers. They'd been seen around but had always managed to slip away, leaving nothing but fear, and sometimes worse, in their wake. The ranger station held more than just the memory of my terror. Investigators found remains in the woods nearby, bones half buried and tents slashed to ribbons. Their leader, the scarred man I'd struck with the flare gun, had a record a mile long, a history of violence, assault, and a fixation on causing fear. He'd once been a guide, someone who knew these woods better than anyone. But after an accident years back, he changed. Whatever kindness or sanity he'd had was long gone, leaving only a hunger for the thrill of terrorizing others. The authorities told me they'd continue looking back, though I didn't stick around to find out if they'd catch the rest of them. My name is Edward Clark, but everyone calls me Souza. I'm 32 years old, and last fall I made the worst mistake of my life. I thought I was just going on another camping trip. I thought I needed peace, time to think, and space to heal after my divorce. But what I found in the Hercules Glades wilderness wasn't peace. It was something else entirely, something I still can't explain. This happened in June. The air was crisp, the leaves were fiery shades of red and orange, and the world felt quiet, as though it were holding its breath. I packed up my RV, a trusty old Ford I'd refurbished myself, and headed to a remote spot deep in the forest. I'd heard about the area from some travel blog. It mentioned breathtaking glades and a challenging hike to a place called Devil's Hollow, perfect for someone who wanted to be alone, or so I thought. The drive was beautiful, but isolating. The farther I got from civilization, the narrower the roads became. I didn't pass another car for miles. When I finally reached the ranger station at the edge of the wilderness, I was greeted by an older woman with sharp, watchful eyes. Her name tag read, Maggie. "You're going all the way out to Devil's Hollow?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I shrugged. "That's the plan. Heard it's beautiful." "It's cursed," she said flatly. "Bad things happen there." I laughed nervously, unsure if she was joking. She wasn't. Her expression didn't change. "If you must go, stay out of the glade after sundown," Maggie warned. The Fork's what it's owed." I brushed off her words as local folklore and left, eager to set up camp before dark. I parked the RV in a clearing not far from the main trail. The spot was perfect, quiet, secluded, and surrounded by towering trees that swayed gently in the breeze. I spent the evening setting up camp, cooking over a small fire, and trying to convince myself I'd made the right decision coming out here. The first sign of trouble came as I was falling asleep. I heard it faintly at first, a soft rustling outside the RV. Probably an animal, I thought, but then came the whispering. It wasn't words exactly, just faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to circle the RV. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound stopped as soon as I turned on the lights. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself. "Just your imagination." The next morning, I decided to hike to Devil's Hollow. It wasn't an official trail, which made it harder to navigate. My compass acted strangely, spinning lazily as if it couldn't find north. I chalked it up to a malfunction and kept going, using the sun to guide me. About halfway there, I ran into a man carrying a hunting rifle. He was tall and weathered, with a face that looked like it had seen more than it cared to. "You shouldn't be here," he said, blocking my path. "It's a public park," I replied, trying to sound confident. He shook his head. "Not this part. The glade isn't safe." "Why?" I asked, more annoyed than scared. His eyes narrowed. "You won't believe me if I tell you. Just don't stay out here after dark." Before I could respond, he turned and disappeared into the trees. When I finally reached Devil's Hollow, I understood why people talked about it the way they did. The place didn't feel right. It was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive, eerie silence. The glade was a wide, open space surrounded by gnarled trees. In the center was a patch of scorched earth, as though a fire had burned there long ago. I took a few pictures, but my unease grew with every passing minute. Something about the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. I noticed strange symbols carved into the trees, circles, triangles, and spirals I couldn't decipher. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, circling the RV like a predator stalking its prey. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, and far too human for comfort. I locked the doors and peered through the window, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The beam caught a shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. The figure tilted its head unnaturally, and my blood turned to ice. The next morning, I found footprints around the RV, barefoot prints too large to be human. My supplies were disturbed, and one of my chairs was gone. I decided I couldn't stay another night. But when I tried to start the RV, the battery was dead. No lights, no engine, nothing. Panic began to set in. That afternoon, I ventured back to the glade, hoping to find cell service or someone who could help. Instead, I found more signs of the supernatural, items scattered around the glade. A rusted pocket watch, a child's shoe, a shattered compass. None of them looked recent. Then I heard it, a voice calling my name. Edward. It was faint, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from a person, it was coming from the trees. By nightfall, the spirits grew bolder. The RV shook violently as something clawed at the walls. The whispers turned into screams. Familiar voices, voices from my past. My ex-husband's voice rang out, cruel and mocking, echoing words he'd once said to me in anger. "You're nothing without me." I covered my ears, rocking back and forth, but the voices wouldn't stop. When the door to the RV slammed open, I grabbed a piece of firewood and ran. The forest seemed to shift as I fled, paths twisting and looping back on themselves. The shadows followed me, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. I stumbled into the glade, clutching the firewood like a weapon. In the center of the scorched earth was a book, a diary, its pages filled with frantic, illegible writing. Desperate, I tore out a page and lit it with my lighter. The moment the page burned, the shadows recoiled, screaming in a deafening chorus. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing on the road, just as a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. A ranger found me and took me to the station. I tried to explain, but my story sounded insane, even to me. Maggie was there, her expression unreadable. "You burned the book, didn't you?" she asked softly. I nodded, too shaken to speak. She sighed. "It won't be the last time someone stumbles into Devil's Hollow. The forest always takes what it's owed." As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the forest was the same shadowy figure, its head tilted, watching me leave. I don't camp anymore. Some places aren't meant for people. Some places belong to something else entirely.
My name is Juan Smith, and I'm 42 years old. This happened just last October, though sometimes it feels like a dream. A fevered, impossible nightmare. But I know it wasn't. The evidence is still on my hard drive, and the memories refuse to fade. I was on a solo trip to Wilson's Creek National Battlefield near Republic, Missouri. As an amateur documentarian and history enthusiast, I had been traveling in my RV for months, recording footage for a series about haunted Civil War sites. Wilson's Creek was next on my list, known for its brutal battle in 1861 and the ghost stories that lingered. People claimed to hear phantom cannon fire, see soldiers in the fog, and even witness the Ray House transform into the bustling field hospital it once was. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the stories intrigued me. Besides, documenting them made for good content. That's all this was supposed to be. A project. Something to keep my mind busy after my wife Claire passed away. I pulled into the parking lot of the Wilson's Creek Visitor Center mid-afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the fields. The park was quiet, eerily so. For a place of such historical significance, I'd expected other visitors, but I seemed to have the battlefield to myself. Inside the visitor center, I met Betty, a sprightly older woman who offered to guide me through the park. Her knowledge was impressive, rattling off battle strategies and casualty numbers like they were yesterday's news. But when I asked her about the hauntings, her tone shifted. "People see things," she said cryptically. "Hear things, especially at night." "What kind of things?" I pressed, angling my phone's voice recorder closer. Betty pursed her lips. "Soldiers, mostly. Lost souls. Some say the battlefield replays itself like a broken record. I'd stay away after dark if I were you." I smiled politely but dismissed her warning. Ghosts weren't real. History was. That evening, I parked my RV in a designated camping area not far from the Ray House. The house was a stark white structure, quiet and unassuming in the fading light. It was hard to imagine it had once been a bloody field hospital. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the park transformed. The peaceful stillness of the day gave way to something heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. I set up my equipment, tripods, cameras, audio recorders, near the Ray House. Around midnight, I reviewed the first round of footage in the RV. My heart skipped a beat when I heard faint, muffled cries on the audio track. They sounded like men shouting orders, followed by a sharp crack that could have been a musket. But when I checked the video, the field was empty. No movement, no source. The next morning, I met Ethan, a park ranger, as I hiked back towards the Ray house. He was young, but carried himself like someone who'd seen more than he let on. "You're the guy camping out here, huh?" he asked, adjusting his hat. "Yeah, working on a documentary," I replied, pointing to my camera gear. Ethan hesitated, then said, "Be careful out there. You might not believe the stories, but this place has a way of getting to people." "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Some folks see things they can't explain. A couple of tourists last year left in the middle of the night, said they heard someone walking around their tent, but no one was there." I nodded, though I didn't take him seriously. Ghost stories were great for tourism, but I needed hard evidence. That afternoon, I ventured deeper into the battlefield. The fields stretched out endlessly, dotted with weathered cannons and plaques marking key moments in the battle. I took some stunning shots of the landscape, but my focus was on the Ray house. As I approached, I noticed something strange. Bits of old fabric and rusted tools scattered near the house. They looked like bandages and surgical instruments. But how could they still be here after more than a century? I reached for my camera, but a faint groan stopped me cold. It sounded human, but when I spun around, the field was empty. That night, the battlefield came alive. I was filming the moonlit fields when I saw it, a flickering light in the distance. It looked like a campfire, but it hadn't been there during the day. As I walked toward it, the air grew colder. My breath misted in front of me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Then I saw them. Shadowy figures moved through the fog. At first, they were faint outlines, but as I got closer, they sharpened into the forms of soldiers. Some marched in formation, rifles in hand, others slumped over, clutching wounds. Their faces were pale and blurred, like watercolors bleeding into paper. I froze, my camera dangling uselessly from my neck. They didn't notice me, or if they did, they didn't care. They were trapped in their own endless battle, repeating the same moments over and over. I stumbled back to the RV, but the activity didn't stop. As I fumbled with the door, a deafening blast echoed through the night. It was unmistakably cannon fire. Inside, the RV felt like a cage. The walls shook and the lights flickered. I heard voices outside, men shouting orders, horses neighing, the clash of metal on metal. But when I peered through the window, the battlefield was empty. The sounds grew louder, unbearable. Then came the knocking. A single deliberate knock on the RV door. I didn't answer. Another knock. Then another, more insistent. Finally, I swung the door open, flashlight in hand. No one was there. But as the beam swept across the ground, I saw fresh footprints in the mud. Boot prints leading away from the RV and disappearing into the field. I couldn't stay another night. I packed up my equipment and tried to start the RV, but the engine sputtered and died. I cursed and grabbed my phone, only to find it wouldn't turn on. Every piece of technology I had was failing. Desperate, I started walking toward the visitor center. The battlefield was pitch black, and the fog seemed thicker than before. As I stumbled through the fields, I heard it again. My name, whispered from somewhere in the fog. Juan? I didn't look back. By the time I reached the visitor center, the sun was rising. Betty was there, opening up for the day. I tried to explain what had happened, but she just smiled sadly. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she asked. I nodded, too shaken to speak. Betty leaned closer. "They're not done fighting. They never will be." I left Wilson's Creek that morning, swearing never to return. But the footage I captured tells a different story. In every frame, just behind me, is a shadowy figure. A soldier, watching, waiting. Some battles never end. My name is Billy Gonzalez, and I'm 35 years old. This happened just a few weeks ago, and honestly, I'm still trying to make sense of it. Clara and I had planned the trip for weeks, an anniversary getaway to the Mark Twain National Forest in southern Missouri. It was supposed to be a break from work, a chance to unplug and enjoy nature. I had no idea how much we'd regret going. We left St. Louis early on a Friday morning, towing our RV behind Clara's truck. The forest was stunning, towering oaks, sycamores with golden leaves, and miles of peaceful trails. Clara, 31, is a history teacher and loves local folklore. She'd been going on and on about Native American legends, specifically something called a skinwalker. I read about them in this old journal, she said as we pulled into the campsite. They're supposedly evil witches that can take on the form of animals, or even people. Creepy, right? I said, half listening as I focused on backing the RV into the spot. I wasn't into ghost stories or folklore, but Clara lived for it. The campsite was remote, no other campers in sight. The nearest ranger station was about 5 miles away. Clara loved the solitude, but something about it made me uneasy. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet where you hear every rustle, every snap of a twig. That first night, things started going wrong. The RV's power system, which had been working fine earlier, suddenly cut out. No lights, no heating. I fumbled with the battery, but it wouldn't hold a charge. I told Clara we'd fix it in the morning. We ate dinner by lantern light, and she kept talking about the legends of the area, how the Osage people once lived there, and how they'd abandoned parts of the forest after strange disappearances. After dinner, we sat outside by the fire, staring up at the stars. That's when we heard it, the faintest sound, like someone whistling a tune. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Clara nodded, leaning forward. "Yeah, maybe it's the wind." But there was no wind. The trees were still. The whistling came again, faint, distant, and then stopped. I tried to shake it off, but I felt something cold in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, we decided to hike a nearby trail. Clara was excited, snapping pictures of the foliage and pointing out wildlife. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest felt off. Around midday, we stumbled across something strange deep in the woods. There was a clearing with a single dead tree. Its bark was stripped, and the ground around it was littered with bones. Animal bones. "What the hell is this?" I muttered. Clara crouched to examine the bones. "It's probably a predator's kill site." She paused, frowning. "But some of these look old, like they've been here for years." I wanted to leave, but Clara kept poking around. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the tree. Carved into the bark were strange symbols, circles, triangles, and jagged lines. "These could be Native American markings, or some psycho's graffiti," I said. "Let's go." That night, the whistling returned. It was closer this time, and I swear I heard my name mixed into the tune. "Billy." "Clara," she whispered, clutching my arm. "Do you hear that?" "Yeah." I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trees. The beam caught nothing but shadows. "Probably just some animal," I said, trying to convince myself. We climbed into bed, but neither of us slept much. Around 3 a.m., Clara shook me awake. "Billy, there's someone out there," she hissed. I listened. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the RV. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood just beyond the fire pit. It was tall, impossibly tall, with arms that hung down past its knees. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed like embers. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I tried to convince Clara to leave. "The battery's dead, the forest is weird, and I just don't have a good feeling about this." "But Billy," she said, "what if we're overreacting? Maybe it's just an animal, or maybe it's not." I snapped, "Let's pack up." We spent the day trying to get the RV ready to leave, but everything went wrong. The engine wouldn't start. The tools I needed were missing. It was like something didn't want us to leave. That afternoon, Clara wandered off to collect firewood. When she came back, she was pale and shaking. "Billy," she whispered, "I saw something. It looked like you, but it wasn't you." That night was the worst. The whistling turned into whispers. They came from all sides, pressing in on us. Billy. It mimicked our voices perfectly. At one point, I opened the RV door thinking Clara was outside, only to find her trembling behind me. "Don't go out there," she begged. The fire kept the thing at bay for a while, but around midnight, it started circling closer. I saw it again, standing just beyond the firelight. It smiled, its mouth too wide, its teeth too sharp. "What do you want?" I yelled. It didn't answer. It just stared, swaying slightly, like it was waiting for something. We knew we couldn't stay. Around dawn, we doused the fire and grabbed our backpacks. I rigged a makeshift torch, hoping the flame would keep the thing away. We started hiking, heading for the nearest road. The thing followed us. I'd catch glimpses of it through the trees, its long limbs, its glowing eyes. It never attacked, but it never let us out of its sight. At one point, Clara tripped and fell. I helped her up, and when I turned back, the thing was standing on the trail, blocking our path. It opened its mouth, and a horrible guttural sound came out. A mix of a growl and a scream. I waved the torch at it and it flinched, retreating into the shadows. We finally reached the road, just as the sun was setting. A park ranger drove by and stopped when he saw us. "You two okay?" he asked, eyeing our disheveled appearance. "Something's out there," I said. "Something not human." The ranger's face darkened. "You were camping in the southern sector?" I nodded. He shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive. That's sacred ground. You should have left it alone." "What is it?" Clara asked. He didn't answer. He just told us to get in the truck. We never went back to the Mark Twain National Forest. We sold the RV and moved to an apartment in the city. But sometimes late at night, I hear the whistling, faint, distant, but there. My name is Doug Hargrave, and back in 2019, I took my old RV out to the quiet, forested edges of North Cascades National Park in Washington State. It was my first real solo camping trip, and I'd been waiting for something like this. A solid getaway from my usual routine back in Seattle. I wasn't exactly the outdoors type, but I figured, why not? I'd bought this RV on a whim the year before, a retirement gift to myself. Though, retired might have been stretching it. Let's just say my company wasn't thrilled when I walked out that morning. The mist hung low over the ground and the air was as crisp as it gets. It felt good to breathe that air without the usual city grime. I settled into my folding chair with a paperback, expecting nothing more from the day than some peace. My plan was simple. Sit around, maybe fish a little, grill up whatever was in the freezer, then call it a night. Easy, right? I hadn't noticed anyone else on my stretch of road. That was one of the things I liked about the park. Vast, quiet, and empty. No tourists, no loud music, and most importantly, no nosy neighbors. I'd parked in a remote area with views of towering Douglas firs and thick ferns carpeting the ground, somewhere off Route 20 where most folks don't bother going. I'd barely been there half a day when I heard a distant crunch of footsteps. Looking up, I spotted a man in the distance, cutting through the trees like he owned the place. He was tall, lean but wiry, with a face that looked as though it had taken a few hits over the years. His dark, greasy hair was shoved under a beat-up baseball cap, and his clothes looked worn, like they'd seen more forest nights than washing machines. He caught my eye, and for a second, I thought he was going to keep walking. But instead, he stopped, gave me a look that lingered just a little too long, then veered off toward my RV. I put down my book and stood up, trying to look casual but still assertive, like maybe he'd get the hint that this was private space. Not that I had any ownership over the forest, but it's natural to feel territorial when you're alone in the woods. "Nice setup you got here," he said in a voice that was rough and gravelly, almost like he hadn't spoken in a while. "Didn't expect anyone out this far." I shrugged, keeping my tone light. "Just me. Figured I'd get some quiet out here." He didn't respond right away. just let his eyes drift over my RV, my cooler, the small stack of firewood I'd gathered. Then he nodded. "You mind if I sit?" I did mind, actually, but I didn't want to come off as rude, so I forced a nod. He plopped down on the edge of the picnic table, eyes still scanning my stuff. "You been out here long?" he asked. "Just got here this morning," I replied, not offering much. "Ah," he said, scratching at his neck. "I've been out here a while myself. Been walking a lot." "Pretty remote place for a hike," I noted, trying to gauge his intentions. His clothes had stains that weren't exactly mud, and his fingernails were caked with something darker. I was already regretting letting him sit. "You ever hear the stories about this place?" he asked, his voice low. "People go missing in these woods." That line would have felt more ominous if it hadn't sounded like the setup for a ghost story. I smirked, leaning back. "Well, I haven't seen any ghosts yet." His expression didn't change. "Not ghosts," he replied slowly. "People." A pause settled over us, thick and awkward. I'd had enough weird encounters back in the city, but something about his presence, the way his eyes bored into mine with a strange intensity, made me uneasy. I cleared my throat, glancing around. "Well, I think I'll head back to my chair. Got some reading to catch up on." "Sure," he said, not moving. "Just be careful, yeah?" With that, he wandered off, not saying another word. I watched him go until he disappeared into the trees and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Something about him was off, but I tried to brush it off as paranoia. I wasn't used to being alone in the woods, after all. Maybe I was just reading too much into things. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little noise, a branch snapping, leaves rustling, made me sit up and look around. I saw nothing, though, and after a few hours I managed to convince myself it was all in my head. That night, I set up a small fire by the RV and tried to relax. But as darkness settled in, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, amplifying every little sound. I could hear my own breathing, the crackling of the fire, the occasional hoot of an owl, but somewhere in the distance I thought I heard footsteps. Slow, steady, and unmistakably human. I froze, straining my ears to listen, but the footsteps stopped just as suddenly as they'd started. I waited, muscles tense, eyes scanning the tree line, but I saw nothing. It was probably an animal, I told myself, though I didn't entirely believe it. After a while, I went back into the RV, locking the door behind me. I'd left a window cracked for some air, and as I settled into bed, I tried to put it out of my mind. I was dozing off when I heard it again, a faint rustling followed by a low creak that sounded like footsteps outside. Heart pounding, I sat up and grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on. I scanned the inside of the RV, then peered out the window. Nothing, just darkness and the quiet shapes of trees swaying in the breeze. I started to turn away when something moved just at the edge of the light. The man from earlier stood there, his face blank, his eyes fixed on the RV. He didn't move, just stood there, staring. It wasn't until I saw the glint of something in his hand that I realized he was holding a knife. I dropped the flashlight, my breath hitching. I was trapped in here, miles from anyone who could help. Grabbing my cell phone, I frantically dialed, only to see "no service" flashing on the screen. Typical. The next few minutes were a blur. I grabbed a metal pipe I'd brought for setting up the awning and inched toward the door. My mind raced through options, each one more useless than the last. He was still outside, pacing now, like he was trying to work himself up to something. I needed a distraction. In a split-second decision, I cracked open the window just enough to toss out an empty beer can I'd left by the sink. It hit the ground with a soft clank, and his head whipped toward the noise. Seizing the moment, I flung open the RV door, lunged out, and swung the pipe as hard as I could. The metal hit his shoulder, and he stumbled back, dropping the knife. I didn't wait to see if he'd get back up. I took off running, my legs burning as I bolted through the trees. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping me going, but I could still hear him behind me, stumbling through the brush, cursing under his breath. I kept running, every instinct telling me not to look back, not to stop. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually the sounds of pursuit faded. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, my heart hammering. I was alone, bruised and shaken, but alive. In the days that followed, I learned that authorities had found traces of what the man had done, shallow graves scattered around the woods, with remains too far gone to identify. They said he'd been hiding out in the park for years, living off the grid, hunting the occasional unsuspecting camper. But when I think back to that night, the thing that haunts me isn't the chase or even the terror I felt. It's the thought of how close I'd come to being just another name on a missing persons list, another story lost in the depths of the forest. My name is Mason Kennedy, and I'm 30 years old. This happened in late September during what I'd hoped would be a peaceful week of RV camping in Ha-Ha-Tonka State Park, Missouri. I had recently gone through bitter divorce, and I needed space to think, breathe, and just be alone for a while. My plan was simple: park the RV, hike the trails, take some photos, and spend my evenings journaling by a campfire. Instead, I found something that still haunts me. I arrived on a crisp Friday morning, the sun spilling through the trees as I parked in a secluded spot near the ruins of Ha-Ha-Tonka Castle. The castle had fascinated me ever since I first heard about it. A grand mansion reduced to stone skeletons after a tragic fire in the early 1900s. People said it was haunted, but I didn't buy into ghost stories. As I stepped out of the RV, I breathed in the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. The air was still, almost unnaturally so, but I chalked it up to being deep in the woods. I unloaded my gear, grabbed my camera, and set off toward the ruins. The castle was more imposing than I'd imagined. Towering stone walls, arched windows, and crumbling turrets stood against the backdrop of the autumn sky. I spent the afternoon exploring, snapping photos of the overgrown ivy snaking up the walls and the jagged remains of what had once been a spiral staircase. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. It was like stepping into a freezer. I found a room with a massive stone fireplace and stood there for a moment, marveling at the craftsmanship. That's when I caught a faint whiff of sulfur, sharp and acrid, like burnt matches. I wrinkled my nose and turned to leave, but I froze when I heard it, a low whisper just behind me. Mason. I whipped around, heart pounding. No one was there. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was dipping below the horizon. I tried to push the eerie experience out of my mind as I set up a campfire and cooked a simple dinner, but the stillness of the forest pressed in on me, too quiet for my liking. I was just starting to relax when I heard faint rustling behind the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the beam illuminated nothing but branches. Probably just a raccoon, I muttered, trying to convince myself. But later, as I lay in bed, I swore I heard footsteps circling the RV. The next day, I decided to hike one of the trails leading to the Devil's Hollow, a ravine shrouded in local legend. The name alone should have been enough of a warning, but I was curious. I'd come here to clear my head, and exploring the park felt like a distraction from my own problems. As I descended into the hollow, the forest seemed to close in around me. The air grew colder, and the light took on an odd greenish hue as it filtered through the dense canopy. I paused to take a photo of a gnarled tree, but when I lowered the camera, I saw something or someone standing in the distance. It looked like a man, but his posture was wrong, too stiff and upright. Before I could focus on him, he stepped behind a tree and vanished. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. That night, I tried to brush it off as my imagination. I lit another fire and sat close to it, hoping the warmth would ease the chill in my bones, but the unease I felt was impossible to shake. I stared into the flames, letting my thoughts drift, when something across the fire caught my eye. A figure stood just beyond the circle of light, its silhouette faint but unmistakable. "Who's there?" I demanded, grabbing my flashlight. When I aimed the beam, the figure was gone. Then, from behind me, I heard a voice. Mason. It sounded like my ex-husband, Scott, but that was impossible. He was hundreds of miles away. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The next morning, I decided to leave. I'd had enough. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine refused to turn over. I checked the water pump, hoping to at least fix the plumbing, but the tank was bone dry, even though I'd filled it before leaving home. Frustrated, I walked to the ranger station, about a mile away. The man on duty, Ranger Martin Holt, listened as I explained my situation, though I left out the strange occurrences. "You camping near the ruins?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, why?" He hesitated before answering. "Strange things happen in that part of the park. Always have. My advice, don't stick around after dark." I wanted to press him for details, but the look in his eyes stopped me. That afternoon, I decided to hike back to the castle ruins, partly out of frustration and partly out of defiance. If the place was as haunted as people said, I wanted to see it for myself. In the same room where I had smelled sulfur before, I noticed something I hadn't seen the first time. A small leather-bound journal wedged into a crack in the stone wall. Curious, I pulled it out and opened it. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting detailing the life of the mansion's original owner, a wealthy businessman named Robert Snyder. One entry caught my attention. "I made the pact. It will bring me wealth and power, but the price is steep. The hollow will never rest." The words sent a chill down my spine. That night, the entity made itself known. The whispers started just after sundown, faint at first, but growing louder. "Mason, Mason." I bolted the RV door and grabbed the journal, flipping through it in search of answers. Another entry described a ritual involving fire and salt to ward off the entity, but it was vague, more of a warning than an instruction. Suddenly, the RV shook violently, as if something massive was pushing against it. I heard scraping noises, like claws raking across metal. My flashlight flickered, and I saw it. A shadowy figure standing outside the window. Its eyes glowed red, and its face twisted into a grotesque grin. I screamed and grabbed the journal along with a box of matches and a pouch of salt I'd brought for cooking. I stumbled outside, heart racing, and made a circle of salt around the RV. The figure watched me, swaying slightly as if amused. "You can't have me," I whispered, clutching the journal like a shield. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. It reached the edge of the salt circle and stopped, hissing like an animal. Desperate, I opened the journal to the page with the ritual entry. I tore it out and lit it on fire, holding the burning paper high. The figure let out a blood-curdling scream and dissolved into a cloud of black smoke, which dissipated into the night. The next morning, the RV started without a problem. I packed up and left the park as fast as I could. I don't know what that thing was. Demon, ghost, or some twisted remnant of Snyder's curse. But I know one thing. I'll never go back to Ha Ha Tonka. Even now, in the safety of my apartment, I sometimes catch the faint smell of sulfur in the air, and at night, when the world is quiet, I hear whispers calling my name. My name is Bradley Erickson, and I'm 42 years old. This happened just a few months ago in Quir River State Park, Missouri. I'd taken my RV out for a long weekend, hoping to find some peace and clarity after losing my wife Emily in a car accident last year. The grief was unbearable, and I thought maybe some solitude in the woods would help me reconnect with myself. I couldn't have been more wrong. The trip started normally enough. I parked my RV in a quiet, secluded spot near the river. It was late afternoon, and the golden sunlight filtered through the trees, making the forest look almost magical. I didn't see any other campers around. but that suited me just fine. I wasn't in the mood for small talk or friendly neighbors. This trip was about healing, or at least trying to. After setting up camp, I took a short hike to stretch my legs and get familiar with the area. The trails were beautiful, winding through dense woods that smelled of pine and damp earth. About a mile in, I stumbled across an old swing set tucked into a clearing. It was rusted and overgrown with weeds, like something out of a forgotten childhood. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't say why. I turned back before the sun started to set, eager to get back to the safety of my RV. That night, I built a small fire and cooked dinner. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves. I tried to focus on the crackle of the fire, but something felt off. The air was too still, like the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, I crawled into bed. That's when I heard it. Laughter. Soft, high-pitched giggles, faint but distinct. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, drifting through the trees. Kids? I muttered to myself. It didn't make sense. There were no families around, at least not that I'd seen. The laughter continued for a few minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me and forced myself to sleep. The next day, I decided to hike one of the longer trails. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn morning that usually lifted my spirits, but the woods felt different now, as if they were watching me. About 2 miles in, I stumbled across the swing set again. I hadn't realized I'd looped back to the clearing. This time, one of the swings was moving, creaking softly as it swayed back and forth. There was no wind. I froze, my heart pounding. For a moment, I considered walking up to the swings to see if someone was there, but an overwhelming sense of dread stopped me. Instead, I turned and hurried back to the trail. That afternoon, I met a park ranger named Chloe Hart. She was checking the area for maintenance issues and stopped by my campsite to say hello. "You here alone?" she asked, glancing at my RV. "Yeah," I said, "needed a little time to myself." She nodded but seemed uneasy. "This part of the park doesn't get many visitors anymore." "Why's that?" She hesitated, then said, "People say it's haunted. Mostly just stories about kids who drowned in the river years ago, but you know how stories have a way of sticking." I forced a laugh. "You're not trying to scare me off, are you?" "No," she said quickly, her expression serious. "Just be careful. If you hear anything strange, don't go looking for it." That night the laughter returned. It started faint, almost playful, but grew louder and more insistent. This time it didn't stop. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight as the sound echoed through the trees. Then I heard a voice, soft and childlike. "Bradley, come play with us." I stood, my blood running cold. "Who's there?" No answer. I scanned the woods with my flashlight, but the beam only illuminated empty branches. The laughter erupted again, this time from behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. When I finally retreated to the RV, I found handprints on the windows, small, childlike prints pressed against the glass. The next morning, I debated leaving, but something kept me there. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the feeling that running away wouldn't help me escape the weight in my chest. I spent the day trying to distract myself with chores, but the unease lingered. When I stepped outside to get some fresh air, I found a small wooden spinning top on the step of my RV. I hadn't seen it before, and I definitely hadn't put it there. That evening, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the swing set clearing, determined to find answers. The swings were moving again, creaking softly in the still air. As I stepped closer, I saw footprints in the dirt, small, bare footprints leading toward the river. The laughter returned, louder than ever, but now it sounded wrong. Distorted, like a tape being played too fast and too slow at the same time. Then I saw them, shadowy figures of children, barely more than outlines, standing by the water's edge. They turned to look at me, their faces pale and featureless. One of them giggled, holding up the spinning top. "Come play with us," the child said, its voice hollow and echoing. I stumbled back, tripping over a root. The figures advanced, their laughter turning to screams. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the sound of their footsteps close behind me. When I reached the RV, I slammed the door shut and locked it. But the laughter didn't stop. It surrounded me, coming from every direction. Desperate, I grabbed the spinning top and hurled it into the fire. The flames roared brighter and hotter than before, and the laughter turned to agonized wails. The handprints on the windows faded, and the air grew still again. The next morning, I left without looking back. As I drove away, I saw Ranger Hart standing by the side of the road. She didn't wave, just watched me with a look of quiet understanding. Even now, I hear the laughter sometimes, faint and distant, as if it's waiting for me to come back. But I won't. Not ever. The trees at Wildcat Hollow were so dense they swallowed the daylight. I'd been in remote places before, but this felt different. Quieter, heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As I pulled my RV into the secluded campsite, I reminded myself this was just another job. 2 weeks in the woods tracking wildlife migration patterns, then back to the lab. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At the ranger station earlier, Evan, the local ranger, had been unusually chatty. He was wiry, with a weathered face and a nervous energy that made him seem out of place in the middle of nowhere. "You're staying near Wildcat Hollow?" he asked, his tone more serious than I expected. "Yes, perfect spot for my research," I replied, thinking he might offer useful advice about the trails. Instead, he leaned in. "Be careful out there. Folks around here talk about a witch." I laughed. "A witch?" "Yeah. She cursed the land a long time ago, or so they say. Crops withered, animals went mad, people got sick. They say she was hanged near the creek, but she didn't really die. Her spirit stayed behind." He hesitated. "Strange things happen around there." I smiled politely, but I didn't believe a word. My work required me to stay grounded in reality, and ghost stories didn't fit into that framework. Now, setting up my gear in the eerie quiet, I found myself replaying Evan's warning. The first night, I barely slept. My dreams were vivid and disjointed, shadows moving through the trees, whispers too faint to understand. I woke up drenched in sweat, the feeling of being watched sharper than before. The next morning, I headed out with my gear to explore the trails. The forest felt alive, but not in the way I'd expected. It wasn't just the rustle of leaves or the scurrying of animals, it was the stillness between the sounds, the way the silence seemed to pulse. By the second day, I found something strange, a pattern of ash in a perfect circle on the ground. At first, I thought it might be the remnants of a campfire, but there were no signs of burning, just the ash neatly laid out. Nearby, I saw a deer standing unnaturally still, its dark eyes locked on me. When I took a step forward, it didn't bolt like it should have. Instead, it walked away slowly, as if it wanted me to follow. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus on my work. But that night, the dreams returned, stronger. This time, the shadowy figure was closer, watching me from just beyond the firelight. By the third day, I was exhausted. My radio wasn't working, and my phone couldn't get a signal. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I'd spent plenty of time alone in the field before, but this felt different. The animals were acting strange too. A raccoon approached my RV in broad daylight, staring at me with glassy eyes. It didn't flinch when I moved closer. I decided to explore further down the Hollow Creek Trail. About a mile in, I stumbled across an abandoned cabin. Its roof sagged and moss covered the wooden walls, but it looked sturdy enough to have survived decades of weather. Inside, I found shelves filled with jars of dried herbs and something that made my skin crawl. Small carvings of twisted faces, each one staring up at me with hollow eyes. In the corner, An old book sat on a makeshift table. Its pages were yellowed and crumbling. The writing inside was in a language I didn't recognize, full of symbols that sent a chill through me. As I left the cabin, the air seemed heavier, like the forest was pressing down on me. That's when I smelled it. Burnt herbs, faint but distinct. The scent grew stronger as I neared my campsite, and when I arrived, the ash patterns were there again, this time circling the RV. That night, I woke to footsteps outside the RV. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. My breath hitched as I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out the window. The beam illuminated only empty trees. Then the footsteps stopped, replaced by a faint tapping on the door. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer, just the tapping. I grabbed the book I'd taken from the cabin and threw it into my pack. Something told me it was connected to whatever was happening, and I needed answers. I bolted outside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The ash circle was unbroken, and the forest was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. That's when I saw her. She stood at the edge of the woods, a gaunt figure with pale skin and hollow eyes. Her black dress fluttered as if caught in a breeze. I couldn't feel. "You've taken enough," she said, her voice a rasp. I froze. "What are you talking about?" "You disturbed the balance," she said, stepping closer. Her feet didn't touch the ground. "You tag, you take, you leave your mark. Now the forest marks you." "I'm just doing research," I stammered, but the air grew colder, and the smell of burning herbs was overwhelming. "I'll stop. I'll leave," I whispered. "It's too late," she whispered. Her voice seemed to come from all around me. "Unless you're willing to make a trade." The witch vanished, and the forest came alive. Roots burst from the ground, snaking toward me. Animals surrounded me, their eyes glowing in the dark. I ran blindly, clutching the pack with the book. Somehow I found my way back to the cabin. Inside, the air was suffocating, and the symbols on the walls seemed to rise. The witch's voice echoed in my head. "Restore the balance." I opened the book, desperate for answers. One page stood out, its symbols burning into my vision. The ritual was clear: burn what I had taken, destroy the tools I'd used, and leave a piece of myself behind. My hands shook as I piled the tracking devices in the book into a heap. I lit a match, and flames consumed the pile, the fire crackling unnaturally loud. The witch appeared again, her hollow eyes watching. "One more thing," she said. "One what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "A piece of yourself," she said, pointing at my arm. The firelight glinted off a knife on the table. I don't remember the pain, just the blood pooling on the floor as the cabin shuddered around me. When I awoke, it was dawn, and the forest was quiet. The ash circles were gone, the animals had scattered, and the air felt lighter. I packed my things and left Wildcat Hollow that morning, the bandage on my arm a constant reminder of what I'd given. But even now, months later, I sometimes smell burnt herbs in the air, and at night, when I close my eyes, I see the witch standing in the forest, waiting. For what? I don't know.
My name is Liam Johnson, and I'm 35 years old. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in ghosts or witches. I teach history, for God's sake. I deal in facts, dates, and evidence. But something happened last fall in Freetown, Fall River State Forest that I can't explain. Something that's haunted me ever since. I had just finalized my divorce after nearly a decade of marriage. To say I was lost would be an understatement. My once stable life had crumbled and I was left with questions I couldn't answer. A friend suggested I take some time for myself, and I figured a weekend camping trip might clear my head. Freetown Woods seemed like the perfect spot, a place steeped in history and folklore. I thought I'd hike, journal a bit, and maybe find some clarity. I loaded up my RV and drove out to one of the more remote campsites on the edge of the forest. The place was almost eerily quiet, with no other campers in sight. I parked, set up camp, and sat back to enjoy the peace. If I'd known what was coming, I never would have stepped foot in those woods. I spent the first day exploring the trails near my campsite. The air was crisp, and the leaves were fiery shades of red and orange. It was beautiful, exactly what I needed. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon a clearing that felt wrong. The air was colder here, and the trees seemed older, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. In the center of the clearing was a circle of blackened stones, surrounded by trees marked with strange carvings. I knelt to examine the stones. They looked burned, as if someone had built a fire here, but the scorch marks didn't fade with the weathering I'd expect. The carvings on the trees were even stranger, symbols I didn't recognize, like crude spirals and jagged lines. Probably some kids messing around, I muttered, brushing it off. That night, as I sat by my RV's small fire pit, I couldn't stop thinking about the circle. Something about it gnawed at me, but I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. As I lay in bed, I heard footsteps outside. They weren't heavy, like a person's, more like something creeping, testing the ground. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window. Nothing, just shadows and trees. The next morning, I decided to hike back to the circle. I'm not sure why. Curiosity, I guess. When I got there, something was different. The carvings on the trees now included my initials, Liam. I froze. My rational mind fought to make sense of it. Maybe someone saw me yesterday and decided to mess with me, but how could they carve it so cleanly, so quickly? And why would they bother? The trail back to camp seemed longer than I remembered. The woods felt darker, and the silence pressed in on me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I was being followed, but every time I turned, the path was empty. When I finally reached my RV, the sun was already low. I made dinner and tried to distract myself by reading, but the unease clung to me. That night, I dreamed of fire. I was bound to a stake in the middle of the circle, flames licking at my feet as shadowy figures chanted in a language I didn't recognize. I woke drenched in sweat, and when I looked down, my arms and legs were streaked with ash and soot. I wanted to leave. I packed up my gear and tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I cursed, checked the battery, the oil, everything I could think of, but nothing worked. I decided to wait until morning to call for help. There was no cell service out here, of course. I tried to distract myself with a book, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the oppressive silence returned. That's when I saw her. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing just beyond the firelight. Her clothes were tattered and her face was obscured by shadow. "Hello?" I called out, stepping closer. She didn't move. "Are you lost?" Still nothing. As I took another step, she vanished. The next night, the temperature plummeted. I huddled inside the RV, wrapped in every blanket I had. Around midnight, I heard the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the rustle of leaves. Then they grew louder, circling the RV, speaking words I couldn't understand. I peeked out the window and saw them, figures with hollow, glowing eyes, standing motionless in the clearing. In the center of them stood the woman. This time, her face was visible, pale, with sunken eyes and a cruel smile. She raised a hand and pointed at me. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. I tried to drive away, but the RV still wouldn't start. Panicking, I grabbed a flashlight and ran for the main trail, hoping to find help. The woods twisted around me, the path shifting and folding back on itself. Every time I thought I'd made progress, I ended up back at the witch's circle. She was waiting for me there. "Stay," she whispered. "You've lost everything. Let me give you peace." Her words burrowed into my mind, echoing my own doubts and fears. I wanted to give in, to let the darkness swallow me, but something inside me fought back. I remembered the leather journal I'd found earlier that day in a hollow log near the circle. It had belonged to another camper, someone who'd written about their own encounter with the witch. They'd mentioned burning something sacred to her to break her hold. I scanned the circle and spotted a piece of cloth tied to one of the trees. It looked old, like it had been there for centuries. Grabbing it, I threw it into the center of the stones and lit it with my lighter. The flames roared to life, and the witch screamed, a bone-chilling sound that echoed through the woods. The figures vanished, and the forest grew silent once more. At dawn, I returned to the RV and tried the engine one last time. It roared to life. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The witch stood at the edge of the clearing, her hollow eyes watching me. I haven't been back to Freetown Woods since, and I never will. My name is James Garcia, and back in 2014, I took my old RV on a much-needed trip to Teton National Park in Wyoming. I'd always been more comfortable with a laptop than a map, so my friends joked that I'd get lost the moment I left the driveway. Maybe they were onto something. I was a software engineer who had spent too many late nights debugging code and not enough time enjoying the great outdoors. I figured it was time to trade the glow of a monitor for some real sunshine. Plus, I thought the change might help me come up with the next big app idea. You know, a guy goes into the woods and comes out a millionaire. Well, at least that was the plan. The drive to Wyoming was uneventful, filled with podcasts and my off-key singing. Upon reaching the park, the towering peaks of the Tetons greeted me like old friends I hadn't met yet. I found a cozy spot at an RV campground near Jenny Lake, surrounded by pine trees and the distant sound of water. As I set up camp, a neighboring RV pulled in. Out stepped a middle-aged couple, William and Olivia Thompson. They were retirees traveling the country, ticking national parks off their bucket list. William had a knack for dad jokes. "Why did the camper bring a ladder to the campground?" he asked. "Why?" I played along. "Because the stakes were too high." We shared a laugh, and they invited me over for dinner. It was nice to have company, and Olivia's cooking beat my canned beans any day. The next morning, I decided to hike one of the easier trails. I'm no mountaineer, and my fitness level is best described as computer chair potato. I packed a small bag, filled my water bottle, and set off. About an hour into the hike, I came across a man carving something into a tree. He was tall and gaunt, with unkempt hair that looked like it hadn't met a comb in years. His clothes were worn, stained with dirt, and who knows what else. "Morning," I offered. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me regret opening my mouth. "Beautiful day," he muttered before turning back to his carving. I glanced at the tree. He had etched a series of symbols, circles intersected by jagged lines. It didn't look like the usual hearts and initials people scratch into bark. "Interesting artwork," I said, trying to sound casual. He paused, the knife still pressed against the wood. "Just marking the way," he replied. "Ah, well, have a good one," I said, deciding it was time to keep moving. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach. Maybe it was just the altitude. That evening, back at the campground, I mentioned the encounter to William and Olivia. "Probably just a local eccentric," William said. "Every place has one. Adds character." "Yeah, maybe," I agreed, but Olivia seemed concerned. "Be careful out there," she warned. "Not everyone you meet in the woods has good intentions." "Noted," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "I'll make sure to bring my superhero cape next time." The next day, I decided to stay around the campground, maybe do some reading, and finally start that novel I'd been putting off. Around midday, a park ranger named Avery Jackson stopped by. She was doing her rounds, friendly and full of information about the area's wildlife. "Seen anything interesting?" she asked. "Besides a squirrel stealing my trail mix, not much," I joked. "Well, keep an eye out. We've had reports of some vandalism on the trails, strange symbols carved into trees." "Actually, I think I saw some yesterday," I said, recounting my encounter. Her expression grew serious. "Did you get a good look at the person doing it?" "Yeah, tall guy, kind of scruffy, seemed off." "Thanks for letting me know," she said. "We'll keep an eye out." The rest of the day was uneventful until evening rolled around. As I was grilling some burgers, William approached me. "Have you seen Olivia?" "Not since this morning," I replied. "She went for a walk a few hours ago and hasn't come back." "Maybe she found a good spot to paint," I suggested. Olivia was an amateur artist, always sketching. "Yeah, maybe," he said, but his eyes betrayed his worry. "Tell you what, I'll help you look." We set off with flashlights, calling her name as dusk settled in. The forest seemed to swallow our voices. After an hour of searching, we decided to inform Ranger Jackson. She organized a small search party, and we continued our efforts. Around midnight, one of the volunteers shouted, "Over here!" We rushed to find them standing near a clearing. On the ground lay Olivia's scarf, stained red. Nearby, the same cryptic symbols were carved into several trees, deeper and more aggressive this time. William's face went pale. "What the hell is going on?" Ranger Jacobs tried to keep everyone calm. "Let's head back. We'll expand the search at first light." Back at the campground, an uneasy silence settled over us. William retreated into his RV, and I could hear muffled sobs through the thin walls. Unable to sleep, I sat outside, poking at the dying embers of the fire. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw the man from the trail standing at the edge of my campsite. "You should leave," he whispered. "Excuse me?" "Bad things happen here. Best to move on." "Did you have something to do with Olivia's disappearance?" I asked, standing up. He tilted his head, a slow grin spreading across his face. "She's with the forest now." I felt a surge of anger and fear. "Where is she?" He took a step back. "Warnings were given," he said before disappearing into the darkness. Heart pounding, I ran to Ranger Jacobs' station. Bursting in, I found her poring over maps. I just saw him, the guy carving symbols. He was at my campsite. She grabbed her radio. "Stay here." Within minutes, a few rangers assembled and they headed out to search. I stayed behind feeling both helpless and frustrated. Hours passed with no word. Just as dawn broke, the rangers returned, their faces grim. "We found something," Avery said. She led me and William to another clearing, deeper in the woods. There, we saw a shallow grave freshly dug. Inside were remains, clothes matching what Olivia had been wearing, and bones scattered haphazardly. William fell to his knees, a guttural cry escaping his lips. I placed a hand on his shoulder, words failing me. "We need to get you both back," Avery said softly. "It's not safe here." As we made our way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees seemed to close in, the canopy blocking out the morning light. Back at the campground, law enforcement had arrived. They questioned us separately. I recounted everything. The symbols, the man, his warnings. An officer named Aiden Clark took particular interest. "We've been tracking someone matching that description," he said. "Goes by the name of Lucas Rodriguez, former forestry worker who went off the grid after some incidents." "What kind of incidents?" "Several hikers went missing over the past few years. Never enough evidence to pin anything on him, but he's our prime suspect." "Well, he's here, and he's dangerous. Don't worry," Harris assured me. "We'll find him." They organized a manhunt. Officers and rangers combing the forest. William was taken to a local hospital. He was in shock. I was advised to leave the area, but something kept me there. Maybe it was guilt, or perhaps a misguided sense of responsibility. Either way, I decided to stay one more night in the RV before heading home. That evening, as the campground emptied, I felt more isolated than ever. The silence was oppressive. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking everything. Around midnight, a loud thud jolted me awake. My heart raced as I listened intently. This time, closer. Grabbing a kitchen knife, not the most heroic weapon, but better than nothing, I crept toward the front of the RV, peering through the window. I saw nothing but darkness. Then a whisper cut through the silence. "You should have heeded the warnings." I spun around, and there he was, inside the RV. Lucas stood blocking the exit, His eyes were wild and unhinged. "How did you get in here?" I stammered. "Doors only keep out those who respect barriers," he said, stepping closer. "Look, I don't want any trouble." "Trouble found you," he sneered. In a panic, I lunged forward, trying to push past him. He was stronger than he looked, grabbing me by the arm and throwing me against the wall. The knife slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. He picked it up, inspecting it like a curious child. "Not much of a weapon," he mused. Desperate, I looked for anything to use. My eyes landed on a canister of bear spray on the counter. With a quick movement, I grabbed it and aimed. The spray hit him square in the face. He screamed, dropping the knife and clutching his eyes. Seizing the opportunity, I darted past him and out of the RV. I ran blindly into the woods, branches slapping against my face. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps and ragged breathing. "You're only making it worse," he shouted. My lungs burned, but adrenaline kept me moving. Ahead, I spotted a faint light, a ranger's station. Pushing myself harder, I burst into the clearing, banging on the door. "Help!" I yelled. The door opened and Avery pulled me inside. "What's going on?" "Lucas, he's after me." She locked the door and radioed for backup. "Stay here." We could hear him outside, circling the station. "No use hiding," he taunted. "Is there another way out?" I whispered. She shook her head. "But help is on the way." The window shattered as rocks came flying through. Lucas reached in, trying to unlock the door. Avery drew her service weapon. "Stop, or I'll shoot." He laughed. "Bullets won't stop what's meant to be." She fired a warning shot, the sound deafening in the small space. He recoiled, but didn't retreat. "Backup is minutes away," she said. "We just need to hold out." He began pounding on the walls, the whole structure shaking. I looked around for anything to barricade the door. "Help me with this," I said, pointing to a heavy cabinet. We shoved it against the door just as Lucas threw his weight against it. The wood creaked but held firm. Sirens echoed in the distance. Lucas seemed to notice, his attacks becoming more frantic. "You brought this on yourself," he yelled. Headlights swept over the clearing as police vehicles arrived. Officers poured out, weapons drawn. "Lucas Rodriguez, stand down," Aiden Clark commanded. Lucas backed away from the station, eyes darting between the officers. For a moment, I thought he might surrender. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a rusted hatchet. "They won't stop me," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "Last warning," Harris shouted. Lucas charged. Multiple shots rang out, and he fell to the ground. Silence settled over the scene, broken only by the crackle of police radios. They approached him cautiously, checking for a pulse. "Well, good. He's alive," an officer announced. "Get a medic." Relief washed over me, my legs giving out as I sank to the floor. Avery placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over." In the aftermath, authorities searched Lucas's makeshift cabin, hidden deep within the forest. They found personal belongings from several missing hikers, including Olivia's journals. They detailed his descent into madness, convinced that the forest demanded sacrifices to preserve its sanctity. Aiden Clark later informed me that Lucas had been a promising environmentalist before a personal tragedy unhinged him. His wife had died in a hiking accident years prior, and he'd blamed the influx of tourists for disrupting the natural order. Lucas Rodriguez was charged with multiple counts, including murder and kidnapping. With the evidence collected, there was no doubt he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars. As for me, I packed up my RV, ready to return to the familiar glow of computer screens and the hum of city life. Nature, it seemed, was more unpredictable than any line of code I'd ever encountered. My name is Mia Garcia, and I'm 25 years old. This happened last October during what was supposed to be a routine work trip. I'm a freelance travel writer, and I'd been assigned a feature on overlooked hiking destinations in New England. It sounded perfect at first, a chance to write, explore, and test my limits. But I left Mount Greylock with more than I'd bargained for. What I experienced there wasn't just unsettling. It was something I still can't fully explain. I arrived at the base of Mount Greylock late in the afternoon, driving my trusty RV into a small, secluded campsite. The air was crisp, and the trees glowed in shades of gold and red. It should have been idyllic, but something about the silence felt unnatural. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just the hum of my RV's engine. As I parked, I noticed a few other campsites nearby, but only one seemed occupied. An old green tent sat pitched a little ways down, but I didn't see anyone around, probably out hiking, I thought, dismissing the odd emptiness. After setting up, I cooked a quick meal, wrote some notes about the day's drive, and crawled into bed. As I drifted off, I thought I heard footsteps outside the RV, soft, deliberate. I told myself it was just another camper returning late. The next morning, I prepped for a hike up one of Greylock's lesser-known trails. I'd planned to take photos for my article and gather inspiration for my writing. As I locked up the RV, I glanced at the green tent again. It looked untouched, and there was still no sign of its occupants. The trail started easy enough, winding through towering maples and oaks. I felt myself relax as the sun filtered through the leaves. But about halfway up, the path became overgrown and harder to follow. My map didn't match the terrain anymore, and my GPS couldn't get a signal. Then I saw them for the first time, tall, shadowy figures just beyond the tree line. I froze, heart pounding. They weren't solid, more like dense patches of darkness that opened in the sunlight. I blinked, and they were gone. Just shadows, I told myself. Tree trunks, maybe? Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I pushed on, snapping a few photos, but my enthusiasm for the hike had dimmed. By the time I made it back to camp, the light was fading, and I was exhausted. As I approached the RV, I noticed something unsettling. The door was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it before I left. That night, the RV's battery died. I couldn't cook, charge my phone, or power the heater. Frustrated, I ate a cold granola bar by flashlight and scribbled notes about the hike. My writing felt forced, and I couldn't shake the unease from earlier. When I finally crawled into bed, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like the rustle of leaves. Then they grew louder, words forming in a language I didn't recognize. My skin prickled as I strained to listen. Sophia, my name, spoken in a voice that sounded eerily like my father's. "Come out, Arya." I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering. My father had passed away years ago. I threw on a jacket and stepped outside, shining my flashlight into the dark. The beam caught movement. A tall humanoid shape standing at the edge of the campsite. They didn't move, just stood there, their hollow faces turned toward me. I stumbled backward into the RV and slammed the door shut, locking it tight. The next morning, I decided to investigate the green tent. Something about its abandonment gnawed at me. Inside, I found a few belongings, a half-empty water bottle, a jacket, and a leather-bound journal. The journal's last entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. "They're watching us. The hollow ones, tall, shadow-faced things that look human but aren't. They follow you, whisper your name. Don't go into the woods at night. Don't listen to the whispers." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Whoever had written this wasn't coming back. By now, I was desperate to leave. I packed up my gear, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I turned the key again and again, but it wouldn't budge. That night, the hollow ones came closer. Their faces, if you could call them that, pressed against the RV's windows, featureless and black. I huddled in the corner with a knife in hand, though I knew it wouldn't do any good. They didn't break in, but their whispers filled the air, louder and more insistent. They called my name, taunting me with memories of my family, my failures, my fears. The next morning, I found a bundle of sage in the abandoned tent. I didn't know if it would work, but I was willing to try anything. That night, as the hollow ones surrounded the RV, I lit the sage and waved it around, chanting every prayer I could remember. For the first time, they seemed to hesitate, their shadows flickering as though caught in a strong wind. But they didn't leave. I realized they weren't just spirits. They were the mountain itself, its ancient, malevolent essence given form. At dawn, I tried the RV's engine one last time. It roared to life. I didn't question it. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The hollow ones stood at the edge of the forest, their empty faces watching me. I never wrote the article. Some stories are better left untold. My name's Alexander Hernandez, and in 2010, I took my RV to a spot near Kenai Fjords National Park in Alaska. I'm not a survivalist or a wilderness guide. I'm an accountant from Atlanta who got fed up with numbers and paperwork, so I figured I'd finally hit pause on life and spend a couple of weeks camping. I drove all the way from Georgia, chasing the quiet, thinking Alaska would be the kind of place where I could just sit back with a beer and let my brain go blank for a while. When I parked the RV in this isolated area just outside the national park, it felt perfect. Not a single person around. I was miles from the nearest campground, let alone a neighbor, and to me, that was ideal. I was setting up my little oasis when I noticed a couple of things off the bat that didn't sit right. The first was the absence of wildlife. I mean, it's Alaska, bears, moose, the whole lot, but around me, nothing. No scat on the ground, no broken branches from animals passing by, just silence, except for the faint rustling of leaves. By day 3, I'd settled into a good routine. Coffee in the morning, a short hike in the woods, then I'd grill up whatever canned meal I felt like eating. It was on one of these afternoon hikes that I stumbled across an old, half-collapsed wooden cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The door was hanging off the hinges, and there was this strange smell around it, a mix of rotting wood and something sharper, kind of metallic. I figured it was rust from some old tool or metal scrap inside, so I brushed it off, but something didn't sit right with me. There were bits of clothing scattered around the area, shirts, old jackets, even a pair of jeans. It looked like they'd been there for years, frayed and faded by the weather. I don't know why, but I felt a chill. Part of me thought I should turn back, but another part, maybe the accountant side that just needs answers, thought I should go inside and take a look around. The interior was even worse. Dirt was caked on every surface. The floor was covered in what looked like animal bones, small ones, maybe birds or rabbits, and there was that same metallic smell, stronger now. I looked up and noticed something hanging from the ceiling. It was a hook, the kind you'd see in butcher shops. It didn't belong there, not in the middle of a forest, but it was there all the same, swaying slightly as if disturbed by some breeze that I couldn't feel. At that point, I decided to head back to the RV. I figured it was best to keep my distance from whatever strange things were left behind in that place. But when I stepped out of the cabin, I could have sworn I heard footsteps, faint and dragging, behind me. I stopped, turned around, and waited, but nothing appeared. The forest around me was dead silent again. Back at the RV, I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I had just psyched myself out. That night, though, I barely slept. I'd brought a shotgun with me just in case of wildlife, and I kept it by my side. Every little noise outside felt amplified, like something was creeping around just out of sight. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Morning came, and I felt a bit stupid. I decided to spend the day fishing in a small creek I'd passed earlier, trying to distract myself, but even out by the water, that eerie silence remained. No birds chirping, no fish biting, just the occasional snap of a twig somewhere behind me, which I tried my best to ignore. The thought that maybe I wasn't alone out here crept up more than once, and I started questioning if I had made a mistake coming out this far. Then, later that evening, as I was grilling up some fish, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, just on the edge of the tree line. I squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing, but all I could see was a figure, a man, maybe, crouching low, watching me. He was dressed in what looked like layers upon layers of dirty clothes, all torn up and mud-streaked, his face partially obscured by a tangle of hair. He was still as a statue, just watching. I shouted out to him, trying to play it cool, asking if he was lost, but he didn't respond. Instead, he slowly ducked back into the trees, disappearing without a sound. Every instinct told me I needed to pack up and leave, but stubborn as I was, I convinced myself that he was probably just some harmless drifter. I thought if I ignored him, he'd go away. The next night, things escalated. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a scraping noise coming from outside. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something was being pulled along the side of the RV. I froze, gripping the shotgun tighter than ever, listening. The scraping moved along the length of the vehicle, stopping right outside the window next to my bed. I didn't dare look out. For a solid hour, I just lay there, sweating, listening to the faint scratching on the metal, then silence. I finally drifted off, hoping I'd imagined the whole thing, but in the morning when I stepped outside, there were muddy handprints smeared along the side of the RV. That was enough for me. I started packing up my stuff, thinking I'd head back to the main road and find a new spot, maybe closer to a town. But as I loaded the last of my things, I spotted him again, standing a few yards away by a cluster of birch trees, staring at me with a blank, almost curious expression. He was holding a long, rusty blade, one that looked like it had seen far too much use, and his clothes were even filthier than before. I didn't think. I raised the shotgun and aimed at him, shouting for him to stay back. He just smiled, a slow, unsettling grin, and started walking toward me, dragging that blade along the ground. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping he'd take the hint, but he kept coming, unfazed, picking up speed. At that moment, I knew I couldn't just wait around. I ran back into the RV, locked the door, and fired up the engine. But the man lunged at the driver's side window, slamming his fist against it, that rusty blade scraping along the glass. I stomped on the gas, swerving as he clung to the side, banging on the window, his face pressed against it with that same terrifying smile. The RV lurched forward, finally throwing him off balance, and I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. After what felt like an eternity, I hit the highway, my heart still pounding. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away, where I could finally breathe. The police in Anchorage were polite but skeptical. They took down my statement and checked out the muddy handprints on the RV, but all they could offer was a half-hearted promise to patrol the area. They didn't even sound like they believed me. Later, out of curiosity, or maybe just out of fear, I did some digging. I found a couple of stories about a man named Jacob, who was known to lurk in those woods, rumored to be some kind of deranged hermit who had lived there for decades. People said he had lost his family in a hunting accident and went off the deep end, becoming obsessed with cleansing the forest of outsiders. My name is Benjamin Davis, and I'm 34 years old. This happened last fall, and while I've tried to convince myself it wasn't real, the scars, mental and physical, remind me otherwise. I was working as a freelance journalist at the time, tasked with writing a piece about haunted locations in New England. I'd always been skeptical about ghost stories, chalking them up to overactive imaginations or clever hoaxes, but after that weekend in the Freetown Fall River State Forest, I no longer have the luxury of disbelief. It started as a simple camping trip. My boyfriend Mason had suggested we go together. He was 30, adventurous, and constantly looking for the next thrill. Daniel, my colleague and the third member of our group, tagged along with his paranormal investigation gear. At 31, Daniel was a tech enthusiast and part-time blogger with a fascination for the supernatural. The plan was simple. Camp near the caves, a section of the forest infamous for strange disappearances and satanic rituals, and see if we could gather enough material for a solid story. We arrived on a chilly Friday afternoon. The forest felt dense, its canopy blotting out most of the light. I tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine as we set up camp, but something about the place felt wrong. The air was heavy, and even Mason, who normally brushed off my concerns, admitted it felt weirdly quiet. After setting up the tent, Daniel unpacked his equipment: infrared cameras, audio recorders, and even an electromagnetic field detector. He was like a kid in a candy store, buzzing over each device. Meanwhile, Mason built a fire, cracking jokes to lighten the mood. I forced a smile and focused on jotting notes in my journal. As night fell, the forest came alive with unfamiliar sounds: branches snapping in the distance, the occasional rustle of leaves. Daniel insisted it was just wildlife, but my nerves were frayed. Then we heard it: faint laughter. It was soft at first, high-pitched and childlike, drifting through the trees. I froze, looking at Mason, who frowned and turned his head to listen. Daniel grabbed his recorder, his eyes alight with excitement. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, as if afraid to scare it off. "Yes," I said, my voice tight. "It sounded like a kid." "It's probably other campers," Mason said, though he didn't sound convinced. He poked at the fire, making sparks fly, but the laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, more persistent, until it seemed to echo from every direction. Daniel checked the recorder but found nothing, just static. That's when I noticed the shadows at the edge of the firelight. Figures darted between the trees, just out of focus. My breath hitched. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing. Mason shook his head. "It's just your imagination," he said. "No," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "She's right, there's something there." The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving us in an oppressive silence. My skin prickled as if the forest itself were watching. The next morning, I volunteered to collect firewood, hoping a bit of distance would clear my head. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I came across a gruesome sight: a mutilated deer carcass. Its body was split open, and strange symbols were carved into its flesh. Flies buzzed around the open wounds. My stomach churned, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. I ran back to camp, breathless, and told Mason and Daniel what I'd found. "Probably coyotes," Mason said, though his tone lacked conviction. "No," I snapped. "Coyotes don't carve symbols into their prey." Daniel's face paled. "Symbols? What kind of symbols?" I sketched them in the dirt, and Daniel muttered something about occult rituals. Mason dismissed it as nonsense, but the tension between them was palpable. That evening, the shadows returned. This time they were bolder, flickering just beyond the firelight. Mason tried to brush it off, but even he was on edge. Daniel set up his camera and stared at the screen, his hands trembling. Then came the voices. They were soft at first, barely more than whispers, but unmistakably ours. I heard my own voice calling from the woods. "Mason? Daniel? Help!" Daniel heard his own voice too, and Mason's name echoed from deeper in the forest. The mimicry was perfect. Too perfect. Mason jumped to his feet, grabbing a flashlight. "Don't go out there," I shouted, grabbing his arm. He shook me off. "It's probably a prank. Someone's messing with us." Before I could stop him, he ventured into the darkness. Daniel and I huddled by the fire, listening to the crunch of his footsteps fade. Then came the scream. Mason ran back, pale and gasping for breath. "There's something out there," he stammered. "Something big. It's not human." The next morning, we decided to investigate the caves, hoping to find answers or at least an explanation. As we approached, the air grew colder and the forest seemed to darken. The entrance to the caves was narrow and jagged, almost like a gaping mouth. Inside, the walls were covered in strange carvings, similar to the symbols I'd seen on the deer. At the center of the chamber, we found a crude shrine made of animal bones and a tattered child's dress stained with what looked like blood. Daniel turned on his camera, but it flickered and died. "What the hell?" he muttered, shaking it. It was fully charged. That's when the laughter returned, louder than ever, reverberating off the cave walls. Shadows danced along the edges of the chamber, forming a tall, humanoid figure with glowing eyes. It stepped forward, its grin impossibly wide. "Welcome," it said in a voice that mimicked Daniel's perfectly. "You've come to play." The figure moved unnaturally, its limbs jerking like a puppet on strings. It circled us, its grin never wavering. "You trespass on cursed land," it said, its voice shifting between all three of ours. "The price must be paid." Mason grabbed a branch from the fire we'd built outside the cave, holding it like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice shook. The entity laughed, a horrible, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "Fire won't save you," it said, stepping closer. Without warning, it lunged at Daniel, dragging him into the darkness. His screams echoed, then cut off abruptly. Mason and I ran, stumbling over rocks and roots as the forest seemed to close in around us. No matter which direction we ran, we always ended up back at the campsite. It was as if the forest itself was alive, trapping us in a nightmarish loop. Mason grew frantic, lashing out at the trees and shouting curses. I tried to calm him, but I was barely holding it together myself. That night, the entity returned standing just outside the circle of firelight. It watched us with those glowing eyes, grinning as if savoring our fear. "You can't escape," it said in my voice. "The forest always takes what it's owed." Desperate, I remembered something I'd read about salt being a protective barrier against spirits. I grabbed a container from my pack and poured a circle around myself. The entity snarled, pacing just outside the line. Mason wasn't so lucky. As he tried to fend it off with a burning branch, it swiped at him, slashing his chest open. He collapsed, gasping for breath as blood pooled beneath him. "Run," he choked, his voice barely a whisper. "Get out of here." I wanted to help him, but the entity was closing in. I stayed in the circle, trembling as the night dragged on. When dawn finally broke, the forest returned to its normal state. The entity vanished, leaving no trace of Mason or Daniel. I stumbled out of the forest, disoriented and covered in dirt. No one believed my story. Of course, the authorities chalked it up to a tragic accident, wild animals or exposure. But I know the truth. Sometimes late at night, I hear that laughter again, faint and distant, and I wonder if the forest will ever truly let me go.